At my engagement party, my mother pulled my fiance's parents aside and said, "You should know she's not really mine." I found them in the kitchen 20 minutes after Blake's parents arrived at the restaurant's private room we'd rented for 30 guests. My mother had cornered them by the dessert table and was showing them something on her phone. "What's going on?" I walked over, but my mother quickly put her phone in her purse. Blake's mother, Kendall, looked uncomfortable, and his father, Robert, wouldn't make eye contact with me. "I was just sharing family history with your future in-laws. They deserve to know what they're getting into." My mother's voice had that sweet tone she used when she was being vicious. What family history? I felt my stomach drop because I knew exactly what she'd done. She'd been angry all week because I'd asked Blake's sister to be my maid of honor instead of my sister Kimberly. "Oh, just the truth about your origins. The Hamptons should know their grandchildren won't actually be biologically connected to our family." Blake came over with drinks and noticed the tension. "What's happening?" His mother took the drink with shaking hands. "Your mother was just telling us that Olivia is adopted. She showed us the adoption papers." Blake looked confused because I'd never told him. We'd only been together 8 months and it had never come up. "You're adopted?" My mother laughed. She doesn't like to talk about it. Embarrassed, I think. Her birth mother was a drug addict who got pregnant at 15. We got Olivia when she was 3 days old. Cost us $40,000 in legal fees, but we wanted to do something charitable. She said charitable like I was a tax write-off. "Mom, stop." But she was already walking toward the main room where everyone else was mingling. "I should tell everyone else too. They're all going to wonder why you look nothing like our family." Blake's father finally spoke. "This is inappropriate. Being adopted doesn't change anything." My mother spun around with fake shock. "Doesn't change anything?" Of course it does. Mental illness runs in her birth family. Her biological uncle is in prison. Her birth mother overdosed when Olivia was 5. These are things you need to know before you marry her. She wasn't even trying to whisper anymore. My Aunt Helen came over with my sister. "What's all this noise about?" My mother grabbed Helen's arm. "I was just explaining to the Hamptons about Olivia's real family. Remember when we had to get her tested for all those genetic disorders because we had no medical history?" Helen looked mortified. "Louise, that's private medical information." But my mother was building momentum. "Private? She's marrying into the Hampton family. They own half the commercial real estate in the city. They deserve full disclosure about her background." She turned to Blake. "Did she tell you her biological father was never identified?" "Could be anyone. The birth mother had multiple partners." Blake stepped between us. "Mrs. Coleman, you need to stop talking about Olivia this way." My mother's eyes narrowed. "I'm the one who raised her, fed her, clothed her, spent $300,000 on her education. I'll talk about her however I want. She's not even grateful. Chose your sister over Kimberly for maid of honor after everything our family has done for her." There it was, the real reason for this performance. My sister stood there smirking. "I told you she'd react this way, Mom." "Olivia's always been ungrateful. We gave her everything and she still acts like she's better than us." My mother pulled out her phone again. "Look, I have pictures of her birth mother from the adoption agency. Olivia looks exactly like her. Same nose, same mouth, nothing like our family." She started showing the phone to other guests who were gathering around. "See? You can tell she doesn't have our genes. We're all tall and blonde. She's short and dark-haired like her birth mother, the drug addict." Blake's mother stepped forward. "Mrs. Coleman, this is cruel. Olivia is your daughter regardless of biology." My mother laughed bitterly. "My daughter? I have one daughter. Kimberly. Olivia was an investment that didn't pay off. We thought adopting would make us look generous to our social circle, but she's been nothing but disappointing. Average grades, average career, and now marrying into new money instead of old money like we taught her." Blake grabbed my hand. "We're leaving." But my mother wasn't done. "Did you know she wet the bed until she was 8? That's not normal. Probably from whatever drugs were in her system when she was born. We had to buy special mattress covers. The smell was horrible." My father finally appeared from the bar where he'd been hiding. "Louise, that's enough." She turned on him. "Louise, you're making a scene." Frederick's voice was quiet, but she ignored him and pushed past Robert toward the dining room where our guests were still standing around with drinks. Robert moved to block her path, but she was already talking loud enough for everyone to hear. Blake grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the exit while his mother went to find the restaurant manager. I could hear Louise's voice carrying through the room telling anyone who would listen about my birth mother and the adoption papers, and how the Hamptons deserved to know what they were getting into. Blake's hand was shaking as he pulled me through the doorway and down the hall toward the parking lot. Behind us, I heard Kendall apologizing to the manager and explaining that we were leaving early due to a family emergency. The cold air hit my face when we got outside, and I realized I was crying without making any sound. Blake opened the passenger door of his car and helped me inside like I was fragile, then walked around to the driver's side and got in. We sat there in the parking lot with the engine off while I shook and cried, and he held my hand without saying anything, because what was there to say? 20 minutes passed before either of us spoke. The windows fogged up from our breathing, and I watched other cars pull in and out of the lot. Normal people doing normal things while my life fell apart in a restaurant I'd never be able to go back to. Blake finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were red like he'd been crying too. He asked if the adoption part was what I'd been afraid to tell him, and I nodded because my throat was too tight to speak. I'd spent 8 months terrified he would see me differently if he knew I came from nothing, that I was born to a 15-year-old drug addict instead of a respectable family. He pulled me closer and said the only thing that matters is that your mother just showed her true character, and it's ugly. We need to figure out how to protect me from her going forward. I started crying harder because he said protect me instead of asking why I lied, or questioning whether he still wanted to marry someone with my background. He held me while I sobbed into his shoulder and got tears and probably snot all over his nice shirt. Blake drove us to his apartment without asking if that's where I wanted to go. I was grateful because I couldn't make decisions or form complete sentences. He helped me out of the car and up the stairs to his second-floor unit, keeping his arm around me like I might fall over. Inside, he sat me on the couch and went to make tea, even though neither of us usually drank tea. I heard him opening cabinets and running water, and the quiet sounds felt safer than talking. When he came back with 2 mugs, he sat beside me and asked me to tell him everything about my adoption, not because it changes anything, but because he wants to know my whole story. I took a sip of the tea and it burned my tongue, but I didn't care. I told him about being adopted at 3 days old, about the Coleman family treating it like charity work, about never feeling like I truly belonged. I told him about the constant reminders that I should be grateful they chose me, that they spent $40,000 in legal fees, and $300,000 on my education. I told him about the genetic disorder testing Louise mentioned, how they took me to specialist after specialist because they had no medical history, and were worried I might have inherited something terrible. I told him about finding out my birth mother overdosed when I was 5, and how Louise told me about it like she was reporting the weather. Blake listened without interrupting, and when I finished he said his parents need to know the full context of what just happened, because Louise's cruelty makes more sense now. I asked him not to tell them yet because I couldn't handle more people knowing, but he said they already know the adoption part, and they deserve to understand why Louise weaponized it. He was right, but I still felt sick thinking about having that conversation. Kendall and Robert showed up the next morning at 9 with bagels and coffee and apologies written all over their faces. Kendall hugged me before I could say anything and told me what Louise did was abusive and wrong. Robert stood in the doorway holding the bag of bagels and looking uncomfortable until Blake took it from him and brought everything to the kitchen table. We sat down, and Robert explained they left the party right after us, and spent the rest of the night calling the other guests. He wanted to make sure everyone understood that Louise's behavior was completely inappropriate, and not reflective of how the Hampton family views adoption, or our engagement. Kendall reached over and took my hand and said she had a miscarriage before Blake, and they considered adoption. She understands how special that bond should be, and she's upset by how Louise turned something beautiful into a weapon. She said they both want me to know I'm already family to them regardless of biology, and her eyes got watery when she said she's grateful I'll be her daughter-in-law. I started crying again because I'd cried more in the past 12 hours than I had in years. Robert cleared his throat and said they support whatever decisions Blake and I make going forward, including cutting off contact with Louise if that's what we need to do. Blake squeezed my hand under the table and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since the party. 2 days later, my phone started blowing up with messages. I was at work trying to focus on a budget report when the texts started coming in one after another. My cousin asking if it's true I've been lying about being a real Coleman. My uncle's wife sending a long message about how adoption is beautiful, but I should have been honest with Blake from the start. An aunt I barely know saying she always wondered why I looked so different from the rest of the family. I went to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall while I scrolled through message after message, realizing Louise had been calling everyone with her version of events. Kimberly posted something vague on social media about family loyalty, and how some people forget where they came from, and it already had 40 likes from relatives and family friends. I felt sick reading the comments where people I'd known my whole life agreed that family should come first, and loyalty matters more than anything. Blake found me crying in the parking lot during my lunch break and gently took my phone away. He said we need to control what information goes out and to whom, that we can't let Louise control the story. He helped me draft a short message explaining that I'm adopted and proud of it, that Louise's behavior at the party was abusive, and that Blake and I are moving forward with our wedding plans. We sent it to a few key family members and close friends. Then I turned off my phone for the rest of the day. I made an appointment with a therapist who handles family problems and adoption issues. Her office was in a building downtown, and the waiting room had soft lighting and quiet music that was probably supposed to be calming, but made me more nervous. When she called me back, I sat on her couch and broke down describing the engagement party before she even asked a question. She handed me tissues and waited until I could breathe normally again, then asked how long Louise has used my adoption as a weapon. I opened my mouth to say it was just that one time, but then I remembered birthday parties where she'd joke about how I should be extra grateful since they chose me. Family dinners where she'd compare me to Kimberly and point out how Kimberly looked just like her while I looked like nobody. The time in high school when I got into a good college and she told people it was because of my sad background story, not my grades. The therapist wrote things down while I talked and introduced words like narcissistic abuse and scapegoating. Suddenly, 28 years of feeling wrong made horrible sense. She explained that Louise's blow-up wasn't really about the maid of honor choice. It was about me choosing my own family and breaking free from her control. I left with homework to write down other times Louise used my adoption to hurt me, and I filled 3 pages that night. Blake admitted he felt guilty for not knowing I was adopted. We were eating takeout on his couch, and he said he'd been thinking about all the times I changed the subject when he asked about my childhood. He wondered what other pain I'd been hiding from him, and whether he'd created enough safety in our relationship for me to share hard things. I told him it wasn't his fault, that I'd gotten really good at hiding the adoption because Louise made it feel like something shameful. He spent the next few hours on his laptop researching adoptee experiences and reading articles about family abuse. He learned about how adopted kids sometimes feel like they have to earn their place in their families, about the fear of rejection that follows them into adult relationships. That night, he apologized for not creating enough safety for me to share something so basic about who I am, and I cried because he was taking responsibility for something that was really about my shame and fear. He said we were going to work on building trust together, so I never had to hide parts of myself again. Kimberly texted asking to meet for coffee. She said she felt bad about how things went at the party and wanted to talk. I was suspicious because Kimberly had never chosen me over Louise before, but Blake said I should hear her out with clear limits on what I'd accept. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our apartments, and she was already sitting at a table when I arrived. She hugged me like nothing was wrong and started talking about how stressed Louise has been lately. I sat down and waited for her to get to the real reason she wanted to meet. She said Louise is really hurt and feels like I embarrassed her at the party by making a scene. I pointed out that Louise was the one who made the scene, but Kimberly just kept talking. She suggested I apologize to Louise and choose Kimberly as maid of honor like I should have from the start, and maybe Louise would calm down. I stood up and told her I wasn't apologizing for being publicly abused. She looked shocked like she couldn't believe I was being so difficult. I left after 10 minutes realizing Kimberly was just Louise's messenger, sent to guilt me into giving up the boundaries I was trying to set. That weekend, Blake and I went through all my financial papers spread across his dining table. I found my old bank statements and realized Louise's name was still on my account from college. She had access to see every transaction even though she hadn't put money in for years. I pulled out my student loan paperwork and saw that Frederick and Louise had co-signed, which meant they got statements about my payments and balances every month. There was a credit card in my name that I barely used, but Louise had insisted I keep for emergencies, and I realized she probably got alerts every time I bought something. Blake helped me make a list of every financial connection to my parents, and we were both disturbed by how much control Louise had kept over my adult life. That $300,000 education investment she'd thrown in my face wasn't kindness. It was building power over me. We spent the rest of the day calling banks and loan companies to remove Louise's access and change my passwords on everything. Kendall called and asked if Blake and I could come to dinner at their house. When we arrived, Robert poured wine, and they said they'd been thinking about our situation and wanted to help in real ways. Kendall said they'd like to pay off my student loans so I wouldn't be tied to the Colemans anymore. I started to protest, but she explained it wasn't charity. It was an early wedding gift and an investment in our future peace. Robert added that they were also happy to cover wedding costs, so Louise couldn't use money as control. They wanted us to have the celebration we choose without anyone holding financial strings over us. I was overwhelmed and crying because I'd never experienced this kind of help without conditions attached. Blake squeezed my hand while his parents smiled and said, "This is what family does. They support each other without keeping score or demanding payback." Kendall hugged me and said she meant it when she called me family, that adoption doesn't make someone less of a daughter, and my relationship with Blake made me her daughter too. I left their house that night feeling like maybe I could build something better than what I'd grown up with. That family didn't have to mean walking on eggshells and earning love through perfect behavior. 3 days after Kendall and Robert's offer to help with the loans, Helen called my cell. She asked if we could meet for lunch without Louise finding out. I suggested a restaurant on the other side of town where none of the Coleman family usually went. When I arrived, Helen was already in a booth near the back, looking nervous and picking at her napkin. She stood up and hugged me tight before I could even sit down. She apologized for not saying anything at the engagement party, explained she was so shocked by Louise's cruelty that she froze. She'd been angry with herself ever since for not defending me in that moment. I ordered coffee and waited while she gathered her thoughts. Helen started talking about when Louise and Frederick were trying to have kids 25 years ago. Louise had trouble getting pregnant and saw doctors for over a year before they suggested adoption. Helen said Louise never wanted to adopt, saw it as admitting failure, but Frederick convinced her it would look good socially. They joined the right clubs and told everyone about their generous decision to give a child a better life. When they brought me home as a newborn, Louise got so much attention and praise for being charitable. Helen said she watched Louise soak up the compliments while barely holding me, always handing me off to nannies when guests left. As I grew up, Louise became competitive instead of maternal. When I learned to walk early, Louise complained I was showing off. When teachers praised my artwork, Louise said I was trying to make Kimberly look bad. Helen teared up, saying she argued with Louise about it many times over the years. She told Louise that comparing us was damaging, and that I deserved to be celebrated for my own achievements. But Frederick always backed Louise and said Helen was being dramatic, that siblings naturally competed. Eventually, Helen stopped bringing it up because it only made Louise treat me worse. She reached across the table and grabbed my hands. She said Louise's cruelty at the party wasn't about the maid of honor choice. It was about me choosing my own life instead of staying grateful and small. Helen wanted me to know that nothing Louise said was true, that I was never a disappointment or investment. She should have protected me better when I was young, and she was sorry for failing me. I cried into my coffee while Helen squeezed my hands and said I deserved so much better than what the Colemans gave me. The next week, Blake and I met with a wedding planner at her office downtown. She had sample books spread across her desk and started asking basic questions about our vision. When she asked about family involvement, I explained the situation with Louise and the engagement party disaster. The planner listened carefully, and then gently said we needed to make a hard decision now about the guest list. She'd seen family drama derail too many weddings, and waiting until later only made things worse. Blake said his vote was for my comfort and safety over social expectations or tradition. I sat there looking at venue photos and felt torn in half. Part of me wanted Frederick there to walk me down the aisle, wanted that father-daughter moment I'd always imagined. But I knew Louise would never let him come alone, and if she came, she'd find a way to ruin everything. The planner suggested we could do a small ceremony with just close friends and chosen family, maybe 30 people total. Blake nodded and said that sounded perfect, intimate, and meaningful. I picked up a photo of a botanical garden with spring flowers and realized every choice felt loaded with meaning about whose family this wedding represented. If we invited the Colemans, we were saying their abuse was acceptable. If we didn't invite them, we were cutting ties publicly and permanently. The planner left us alone to talk, and Blake pulled his chair close to mine. He said whatever I decided he'd support completely, but he wanted me to know I didn't owe Louise anything, not even a wedding invitation. I put the venue photos down and told the planner we'd get back to her about the final guest list. We spent another hour looking at flowers and catering options, but my mind kept circling back to whether I was brave enough to have a Coleman-free wedding. That night I couldn't sleep and ended up on Blake's couch with my laptop at midnight. I started searching for information about my birth mother using the few details Louise had mentioned at the party. I typed in keywords about overdose deaths and adoption agencies and teenage mothers from my birth year. After an hour of searching, I found a memorial page for a woman who died 23 years ago. The timeline matched exactly with what Louise said about my birth mother dying when I was 5. There were photos posted by family and friends. She had dark hair like mine and the same eye shape, the same mouth. I scrolled through comments from people who loved her and my throat got tight. Someone named Sarah, who said she was the woman's sister, wrote about her struggling with addiction after getting pregnant at 15. She wrote about how hard her sister tried to stay clean, how much she loved her baby even though she couldn't keep her. Sarah wrote about visiting her sister in rehab and how proud she was when her sister got 6 months sober before relapsing. I read every comment twice and realized this woman was a whole person with a story and people who cared about her. She wasn't just the drug addict birth mother Louise described at the party. She had a name and a sister who missed her and friends who remembered her laugh. Blake found me at 2 a.m. still staring at the memorial page with tears running down my face. He sat beside me and wrapped his arms around me without saying anything. I showed him the photos and the comments and tried to explain that I was grieving for someone I never knew. He held me while I cried for this mother who gave birth to me and then lost her battle with addiction. I cried for the history that was kept from me and the questions I'd never get to ask her. Blake eventually closed the laptop and carried me to bed, staying awake beside me until I finally fell asleep. A few days later, Kendall called and invited us to dinner at their house, just the 4 of us. When we arrived, the smell of garlic and herbs filled the whole first floor. Kendall had cooked chicken parmesan, which I'd mentioned loving once months ago at a casual dinner. I was surprised she remembered such a small detail. During dinner, Robert told stories about Blake as a kid, like the time he tried to build a treehouse and got stuck on the roof. Kendall added details about Blake's terrible poetry phase in middle school when he wrote dramatic verses about everything. They laughed together in this easy way that showed decades of shared memories and inside jokes. I watched them and realized this was what normal family dinners looked like. People who genuinely enjoyed being together without tension or performance. After we finished eating, Robert asked if I wanted to see his study. He led me down the hall to a room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a big wooden desk. He showed me the bookshelf where he kept family photos going back 3 generations. Then he pointed to a frame on the second shelf with a photo of me and Blake from our engagement party, taken before everything went wrong. He'd already added us to the family collection. Kendall appeared in the doorway and said they wanted to start a new tradition of Sunday dinners with just the 4 of us. She explained it would be a space where I could experience family without having to perform or prove anything. Robert added that they considered me their daughter now, regardless of what any paperwork said. I started crying again because I kept learning that family could be safe and kind and chosen. Kendall hugged me and said they were sorry I spent 28 years not knowing what this felt like. She promised they'd keep showing me until I believed I deserved it. The next Tuesday, Blake's phone rang while we were making dinner at his apartment. He looked at the screen and showed me it was Louise calling him directly. He let it go to voicemail and we waited while she left a message. When he played it back, Louise's voice came through the speaker cold and threatening. She said she'd make a scene at the wedding if we didn't include her properly in the planning and give Kimberly a prominent role in the ceremony. She reminded Blake that she had rights as the mother who raised me and spent a fortune on my upbringing. If we excluded her, she'd make sure everyone in our social circle knew how ungrateful and disrespectful I was being. She'd tell everyone the truth about my background and my birth family's problems. Blake's jaw clenched tight as the message continued. She ended by saying she expected a call back within 24 hours to discuss her role in the wedding. Blake looked at me expecting me to be upset, but I felt strangely calm. Louise had just shown exactly who she was, and removed any doubt about whether she deserved an invitation. We saved the voicemail, and Blake made a backup copy to his computer. I told him we needed to make a clear decision about boundaries instead of hoping Louise would calm down over time. My therapist's words echoed in my head about how narcissists escalate when they lose control. Louise was just getting started with her campaign to punish me for choosing Blake's family over hers. In my next therapy session, I brought up the voicemail, and my therapist suggested we work on drafting a boundary letter to Louise. We spent the hour outlining clear statements about her behavior at the engagement party being abusive and unacceptable. My therapist helped me write down my need for space to plan my wedding without Louise's interference. We included specific consequences if she continued to harass me or Blake or tried to sabotage the wedding. My therapist kept removing emotional language from my draft and making it more factual and firm. She explained that narcissists twist emotional appeals and use them as ammunition, but they struggle more with clear boundaries stated as simple facts. I practiced reading the letter aloud until I could get through it without my voice shaking or tears starting. My therapist reminded me that Louise's reaction would be explosive and ugly, but that didn't mean I was wrong to set these limits. Blake offered to be there when I delivered the letter, but my therapist suggested I needed to do this myself. She said it would prove to me that I could stand up to Louise without someone protecting me. I folded the letter and put it in my purse, knowing I'd need to deliver it soon before I lost my nerve. 2 days later, Frederick called me for the first time since the engagement party. His voice sounded tired when he asked if we could meet privately to talk. I agreed, and we met at a park near my old high school on a Thursday afternoon. He was already sitting on a bench when I arrived, looking older and sadder than I remembered. He stood up and hugged me carefully like he wasn't sure I'd accept it. We sat down and he started apologizing for not stopping Louise at the party. He said he'd been replaying that night over and over and feeling ashamed of his silence. Frederick admitted he'd always known Louise was harder on me than on Kimberly, but he told himself it wasn't that bad. He convinced himself I was sensitive or reading too much into things. Seeing her cruelty so publicly and so deliberately made him realize he'd been enabling abuse for decades. He said he wanted a relationship with me and any future grandchildren, but he didn't know how to stand up to Louise after 40 years of avoiding conflict. His hands shook slightly as he talked, and I felt sad for him, but also clear about what I needed. I told him I needed him to actually defend me, not just feel bad privately after the damage was done. I needed him to set boundaries with Louise and mean them, to choose me over keeping peace with his wife. Frederick nodded slowly and said he'd try, but we both knew he probably wouldn't change. We hugged goodbye, and I walked back to my car feeling sad for him, but also sure that his regret without action wasn't enough anymore. Saturday morning, I woke up early and drove to my parents' house before I could change my mind. The boundary letter was in my purse, and my hands were sweating on the steering wheel. I knew they'd both be home on a weekend morning. I parked in the driveway and walked up to the front door with my heart pounding. Louise answered after the second ring, and her face lit up with fake happiness. She immediately started talking about wedding plans like nothing had happened, asking about dress shopping and venue choices. I interrupted her and said I needed to read something to her. Her smile faltered and she looked confused. I pulled out the letter and started reading it aloud while she stood in the doorway. I outlined her abusive behavior at the engagement party, listed specific examples of how she'd humiliated me publicly, and stated my boundaries going forward. Her face went from confused to angry to rage-filled as I kept reading. When I finished explaining the consequences if she continued harassing me or Blake, she screamed that I was an ungrateful bitch. She said I should be on my knees thanking her for rescuing me from foster care and giving me a life. She was making a huge mistake cutting off the only family I had. Frederick appeared behind her in the hallway looking uncomfortable but staying silent like always. I told them both I was done being their emotional punching bag and scapegoat. Louise started shouting about the wedding and threatening to show up anyway. I turned and walked back to my car while she stood in the doorway yelling. My hands shook as I started the engine, but I also felt powerful for the first time in my life. Within 2 hours, my phone started buzzing with notifications. Louise had posted a long rant on Facebook about ungrateful adopted children who turn on the families that saved them. She didn't name me directly, but it was obvious to anyone who knew us. She shared the adoption agency photo of me as a newborn and wrote paragraphs about the sacrifice and expense of raising someone else's child. She painted herself as a martyred saint who gave everything to an ungrateful daughter. Kimberly shared the post immediately with comments about how some people forget where they came from. Several family members liked and commented, agreeing that young people today don't respect their parents or appreciate what they're given. I watched the post blow up on my phone screen feeling sick. Then Helen commented calling out Louise's manipulation directly, and several of Blake's family friends jumped in supporting me. The comment section became a battlefield with people taking sides. Kendall texted me screenshots of everything before Louise could delete any of it. She said this was clear evidence of harassment if we needed it for legal protection later. Blake came home from the gym and found me staring at my phone. He took it away and made me tea while I told him about the Facebook post. He wasn't surprised and said Louise was showing everyone exactly who she was, which would help us in the long run. Over the next week, my phone kept lighting up with messages from unexpected people. 2 women from Louise's book club sent private messages saying they'd always thought Louise was too hard on me. They were glad I was standing up for myself and they wanted me to know they supported me even if they couldn't say so publicly. A cousin I barely knew called and left a voicemail about her own mother being the family scapegoat. She recognized the patterns in what Louise was doing and offered to testify about Louise's behavior if I ever needed witnesses. Blake's sister sent a long text saying she was honored to be my maid of honor and she'd seen how cruel Louise was at family gatherings over the years. Even the restaurant manager from the engagement party mailed a handwritten note to Blake's apartment. He said he'd never seen such inappropriate behavior from a parent at a celebration, and he hoped I was okay. Each message felt like validation, that I wasn't crazy or overdramatic. The support didn't erase the pain of Louise's rejection, but it helped me realize her version of events wasn't the truth everyone believed. Some people could see through her performance to the abuse underneath. The week after sending the boundary letter, Blake and I sat at his kitchen table with wedding magazines spread everywhere, and Kendall video calling from her home office during her lunch break. She'd been texting me venue ideas for 3 days straight, clearly more excited about wedding planning than her actual job as an investment banker. We decided on a botanical garden about 40 minutes outside the city that had a glass conservatory for ceremonies and outdoor gardens for reception photos. The space only held 50 people maximum, which felt perfect, because it meant we could be selective about who witnessed our marriage. Kendall pulled up the venue website on her screen and started crying happy tears when she saw the spring flower displays, saying it looked like something from a fairy tale. We spent 2 hours making a guest list that included Helen, Frederick, Blake's extended family, our close friends, and a few work colleagues who'd become genuine friends over the years. Louise and Kimberly's names never made it onto the paper, and each time we skipped over them, I felt lighter instead of guilty. The next Saturday, Kendall drove into the city and took me to 4 different bridal shops, and at the third one, I found a simple silk dress with lace sleeves that made me feel beautiful without trying too hard. Kendall stood behind me in the mirror dabbing her eyes with tissue, and told the consultant that her future daughter-in-law looked perfect, and I realized this was the mother-daughter shopping moment I'd imagined as a kid, but never experienced with Louise. We chose a ceremony format that let us write personal vows about choosing each other and building family through intention rather than obligation. And when we told Robert our plans over dinner, he offered to walk me down the aisle if I wanted that tradition, or we could walk together as a couple if I preferred. Every choice felt like taking back joy that Louise had tried to poison with her cruelty, and I kept waiting for anxiety to hit. But instead, I just felt excited about marrying Blake, surrounded by people who actually cared about us. 2 months after I delivered the boundary letter, my phone rang with Frederick's number, and I almost didn't answer. He asked if we could meet at the same park where we'd talked before, and something in his voice sounded different, so I agreed. When I arrived, he looked tired but also determined in a way I'd never seen from him. He explained that living with Louise had become unbearable since I'd cut contact, because she spent every day obsessing over my rejection and planning ways to crash the wedding or turn our social circle against me. Frederick said he'd finally told her that her behavior toward me had been wrong for years, and he planned to attend my wedding even if she forbade it, which was the first time in my memory that he'd openly stood up to her about anything. He admitted this decision would probably make his marriage miserable, but he was tired of being part of abusing me through his silence, and he wanted to know his future grandchildren without the poison Louise would bring to those relationships. I listened carefully because Frederick had disappointed me so many times by choosing Louise over basic decency, but his eyes looked genuine when he said he understood if I didn't trust him yet. I told him I was cautiously hopeful, but he needed to maintain these boundaries long-term and not just perform for the wedding, then go back to enabling Louise's cruelty. He nodded and said he knew he had decades of damage to make up for, but he wanted to try. We made plans for him to attend the ceremony, and then he asked if he could walk me down the aisle, and I started crying in the middle of the park, because I hadn't let myself want that until he offered it. The morning of our wedding, I woke up in Kendall and Robert's guest room because Kendall had insisted on having me stay over the night before, so we could get ready together. The botanical garden looked perfect with late spring flowers blooming everywhere, and white chairs set up in the glass conservatory, where sunlight filtered through and made everything glow. Kendall helped me with my dress and kept crying while saying she wasn't crying, and Robert knocked on the door to tell us the guests were arriving and everything looked beautiful. I could see Frederick through the window standing near the entrance in his best suit looking nervous, and Blake's sister came in to tell me Blake was pacing near the altar, like he might pass out from anticipation. When the music started and Frederick offered his arm, I could see tears in his eyes, and as we walked down the aisle between 50 people who genuinely loved us, he whispered that he was proud of me. Blake's face when he saw me made every hard moment worth surviving, and Kendall dabbed her eyes throughout the entire ceremony, while Robert beamed like he was gaining the daughter he'd always wanted, rather than losing his son. We exchanged vows about choosing each other and building family through love instead of obligation, promising to break the cycles we'd inherited and create something healthier for any future children. When we kissed, everyone cheered, and I looked around at Helen smiling with tears running down her face, and Blake's sister grinning, and Frederick looking genuinely happy for maybe the first time in years. Louise and Kimberly were notably absent, but their absence felt like freedom rather than loss, like we'd finally cut out an infection that had been poisoning everything for too long. At the reception, Helen gave a toast about chosen family and breaking cycles that made half the room cry, and Blake's sister talked about how I'd made her brother happier than she'd ever seen him. I danced with my new husband surrounded by people who saw and valued the real me, not the grateful charity project Louise had tried to force me to be. On our honeymoon in Italy, we spent mornings drinking coffee on our hotel balcony and talking about what family would look like for us going forward. Blake said he wanted kids someday, but only if we both felt ready to break the cycles we'd inherited. Him from privilege that let him ignore other people's pain, and me from conditional love and emotional abuse. We talked about how we'd raise children to feel secure and valued for who they were instead of what they achieved or how they made us look. I told him about my therapy sessions and how I was working through adoption trauma and learning to accept genuine love without constantly waiting for conditions to appear. Frederick had started calling me weekly since the wedding, and we were slowly building a real relationship separate from Louise, though I knew it was hard for him to maintain boundaries when he still lived with her. Kendall and Robert had fully embraced me as their daughter, and we'd started Sunday dinners where I was learning what healthy family dynamics actually felt like without walking on eggshells or performing gratitude. Some relatives still sided with Louise and posted passive-aggressive things on social media about ungrateful children, but I was at peace knowing I'd chosen my own well-being over performing gratitude I never owed. The work of healing wasn't finished and probably never would be completely done, but I was building a life where I was valued for who I actually am, rather than tolerated as a charity project, and that felt like the happy ending I never knew was possible.